Hello.
Hello.
Oh, hey there.
How are you? Oh,
Not too bad for Wednesday.
yeah, I feel that. Yeah. Well, you ready to get started on chapters 3 and 4?
Yeah, I think so. A little meatier than chapters one and two.
Definitely meteor. Okay, cool. Well, okay, I guess I'll start with the spiel. Hey y'all, it's Becky here from the Beckosphere, and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, hi, my name is Becky, and every Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Okay. I talk about the climate here, the problems and the solutions. I'm mostly on YouTube, but I am doing the book club here along with my friend Mickey, who has a background in is it environmental stuff? Wait, I just lost your title. You say your title.
Environment. Oh, well, hello, buddy. I'm Mickey. I have a background in environmental science, environmental sampling, and I'm an energy advocate. So,
Nice. Okay, cool. So yeah, so we have been reading Bill Gates' book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, and we started with the introduction through chapter 2, which was last week. If you're looking on stereo, it should be in our previous video options. If it's on YouTube, check out the Climate Book Club playlist for that. But yeah, so now we're doing chapter 3, which is called 5 Questions to Ask Every Climate Conversation, in Every Climate Conversation. So, um, it looks like the connection's being wonky for a sec. So let's give that a moment. Okay, you good, Mickey?
yeah, I was just checking a couple settings.
Oh, okay, cool. All right. Well, yeah. Okay. So 5 questions to ask in every climate conversation. The first one is, how much of the 51 billion tons are we talking about? So he talks. I didn't know this number. Had you heard of this number before, Mickey?
I've heard of it, but it rarely gets in any real conversation.
Interesting. Yeah, I hadn't heard of it before. So apparently 51 billion tons, which billion tons is the same thing as saying gigatons, I think. Is that what he said? Yeah. A gigaton is a billion tons. So, just so you know, same thing. But yeah, 51 billion tons is the main number of, is it gas that we use? Yeah, the
It's
main number
the
of,
yeah the
is it fossil
annual
fuels or
total.
just gas?
Yeah.
I think it's just gas. Yeah, so the annual total of gas worldwide.
Yeah.
So when someone is bringing up, um, we're going to reduce this by this amount of tons, now we have a number to compare it to, which is good because it's a lot easier to envision how helpful something is if you know what percentage it's representing. So yeah, 51 billion tons. Yeah. Any addition to that, Mickey?
No, I mean, I think, when we talk this, at least this first section of it, the 51 billion tons, he does something that I think is really good for people who are not, I don't know, not well versed in maybe from a STEM background or the climate change background, is he tries
Mm-hmm.
to give you a visualization and some context, which is very helpful, when you're trying
Yeah, it
to
is.
really wrap your head around such a large problem. Even if you are just tackling one issue in that large
Mm-hmm.
problem. Gives
Mm-hmm.
you a little more perspective of either what you are, what the effectiveness is of something of real change, or how much more work we've got to do.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. He does a very good job of um clarifying the numbers because numbers can be so abstract, like in these kind of discussions. So it's good that he's doing that. Yeah, he also, so he as I believe we had mentioned in the previous section, he runs the breakthrough energy is it a company or
It's a think tank.
think tank? Okay, yeah. So that that think tank funds only technologies that could remove at least 500 million tons a year if they were successful and fully implemented. That's roughly 1% of global emissions. Technologies that will never exceed 1% shouldn't compete for limited resources we have getting to zero. I really liked how he put that because it's true. We kind of really do need to narrow down on the most useful things. Because if we don't, then we're just going to be using up resources we don't really have the ability to just play nilly willy with. So
Yeah, you do have to do that. Otherwise, your resources are stretched, and you're probably not going to get as many projects as you would like to get done.
exactly, you won't get as much bang for your buck.
Yeah.
Yeah. So his first tip for the first question that you should ask people, and again, the question is, how much of the 51 billion tons are we talking about? His tip for that question is, whenever you see some number of tons of greenhouse gas, convert it to percentage of 51 billion, which is the world's current yearly total emissions in carbon dioxide equivalents. So it makes you more literate in the conversation you're trying to have. The second question is, what's your plan for cement? And yeah, that's an
You
important
know,
question that a lot of people don't ask.
yeah, but I know, like, when he goes to this little section, he's talking about building things all together. But even just cement itself is something that you see a lot of construction people looking to find solutions for.
Yeah, definitely. So he was saying that passenger cars represent less than half of all emissions from transportation, which turns to 16% of all emissions worldwide, whereas making steel and cement accounts for around 10% of all emissions. And then he gave us a lovely graph or a table that dives more into the each parts, and making things, which is cement, steel, and plastic, represents 31%. So me, by doing my little mathy math, the fact that you just said that steel and cement only equate to 10%, is that implying that plastic therefore contributes 21% of our greenhouse gas emissions?
I'm not sure because you call it a graph. That's such an insult to everybody,
Shut
to
up.
STEM people. But
I
it's
I
he
corrected
the
myself. The
table.
table.
The table is, I think, global, and I don't see where he mentions the 10% if he mentions that global or just the U.S.
He, I think it's global
I mean, if
because he
if
said
that's global,
before
then
passenger
yeah,
cars. Yeah,
then plastic makes up the other 21%.
21%, almost as much as electricity. That'd be crazy if that was true. But like,
Yeah, I
also, I'm not
mean,
too surprised
no, I'm not either.
con considering how plastic is everywhere.
Yeah, and we use it for everything. I, I'm seeing if there's an appendix for some of his charts in the back here.
Mm,
Okay, there might be here. Find a little more I don't see one, but uh,
yeah, I'm assuming he was referring to worldwide for the previous statistic
yeah,
because
I think we can assume that. Um, yeah, I don't see anything on that. But
but
yeah,
it's
let's assume
interesting that
that's.
he didn't address that. But I guess he will in the chapter that is
Yeah,
called Making Things. So,
I think so, and really, that could be a whole nother book, and I think a couple people have written that book before.
yeah.
You know,
Well, there's the Cradle to Cradle book, which talks
that's
about
true.
making things next, sort of. That's a really good book. I feel like if I can't figure out what book to read next for this book club, I might go back and try to read the Cradle to Cradle book because I think it's really interesting. And it's an important concept for us to think about. I don't know.
Mm.
Anyways, okay, so therefore, the second tip for the second question is, remember that emissions come from 5 different activities, and we need solutions in all of them. The third question that you should always ask in a conversation about climate change is how much power are we talking about?
Yeah. Well, to me,
And
this is probably the biggest one,
yeah.
because there are, I guess, two things really that hit me, because how much power it is really a scale thing that people don't realize. And
Mm-hmm.
just recently, a new report came out, and I think it's saying the same thing that a report a couple years ago said, that basically, as we try to meet our decarbonization goals and electrify everything goals, basically at minimum, electricity load is going to double by 2050.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
Mm-hmm.
if you take that even at just at a just you know just as it
Face
is,
value.
yeah, the face value, that's the phrase I was looking for. Um, you've got to consider, the power. And I think he does a nice, simple explanation for your, kilowatts to gigawatts, because it does really
Mm-hmm.
get lost when you start talking about what you want to replace certain things with, how much something uses. Um, and unfortunately, it just ends up being, there is a major, you see this when activists start advocating for something without understanding how much power that's actually going to supply for,
Right.
that term and that length of time. So I'm glad he had, even just mentions this, even for, what is it, 4 paragraphs.
Yeah. Yeah. That's more than four. I don't know. Some of them are shorter than others.
About
And
four, you know.
he says the tip for that one is whenever you hear kilowatt, think house, gigawatt, think city, and 100 or more gigawatts, think big country. Yeah, it's good. He's kind of like centering our minds in like like centering the terminology, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay, so the fourth question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, no, I mean, I was just going to agree with you there.
Okay, cool. Glad you agree with me there. Okay, the fourth question is how much space do you need? Which is also a very important question. And he has a table, um, since we're salty about it, uh, that shows the energy source and watts per square meter. And I mean, this is not a surprise. One of the reasons why fossil fuels are so popular is that they are really um, power dense, so they can supply a lot of watts per square meter. So it's 500 to
Yeah.
10,000 watts per square meter. The closest thing to that is nuclear, that can produce 500 to 1,000 watts
Yeah.
per square meter. And then it significantly drops to only 5 to 20 watts per square meter for things like solar, hydropower, and wind is only 1 to 2 watts per square meter. I don't know why he's mentioning biomass and
I mean,
biofuel and stuff like that, because I know he's doing it for the aviation thing, but then I'm still not even convinced that it should be really part of the discussion.
yeah.
He hasn't convinced me yet on why he keeps bringing it up. But
Well, yeah, and the space thing to me is just as important as the power because of this table.
yeah.
Um, Biomass at this point is very much basically is never in the discussion for this. But I'd argue,
Mm-hmm.
or I disagree with him here in this chart, watts per meter, is that I'd flip nuclear and fossil fuels. There's
Really?
there are Yeah. Ultimately, what this comes down to is what variables he's using for square meter. If he's using just the plant itself, or if he's using everything that's included in the land, around the plant. Because 90% of the other charts that I've seen and read for watts per square meter versus energy source, nuclear is top, then it's fossil fuels, solar, hydro, solar,
Interesting.
wind. Which ultimately it doesn't matter, um, because they're both very energy dense, but nuclear by far is much more energy dense. just by any other
Mhm.
metric.
Mhm.
But that's, I mean, ultimately what he's, in terms of what he's trying to get across here, it makes sense. And again, it's saying, hey, what this is what you've got to consider for the reality, and what we actually would need. So he's,
Yeah.
basically laying out. You can't just say you want something and expect it to work for you.
True, true. Though I would argue that I think that there are more opportunities for multi-use of the land in cases of like solar and wind. So even though they are technically taking up a lot more space, I think that the spaces can be multi-purposed. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the space is just being used for just that.
No, I mean, and to me, that's why even though solar wind are, not my, they should be used in situations where they're most effective. And
Yeah.
there are places like there are great maps that show you where, and energy, the planners tend to use these maps where solar would be most effective,
Yes.
year long. And that's where it makes the most sense to put it. And then, same with wind. And I think,
Mm-hmm.
the next chapter is a little more about that. But that's what, happens. And then on rooftops, brownfields, things like that. And I think I read something currently that there was a couple of solar farms at this point, smaller ones, but they basically use the underlying ground as a pollinator garden, which is great.
Mm.
If that
Mm-hmm.
land is not being converted from something that's more productive, if that was barren land before, you could you remediate the soil, pollinator plants. That's great. I guess that's
Yeah,
that
exactly.
situational basis for multi-purpose.
Yeah, I heard of something similar where solar could actually be kind of a circuit cover crop in a way by cooling down the land beneath them, and that allows for more plants to grow. Plus, also, the transpiration that happens with the plants cools down the air around the solar panels that actually do best around like 70 degrees ish. And so for areas that have a lot of sun but are also really hot, that could be a good way to make solar panels more effective. And I
Yeah.
also heard for wind, just having cattle graze around wind farms and that kind of thing, that would work.
Yeah, wind is just a little different dealing with situations than solar is, but um, you know, that discussion goes somewhere else too.
Yeah. So the tip for question number 4 is if someone tells you that some source, wind, solar, nuclear, whatever, can supply all the energy the world needs, find out how much space it will require to provide that much energy.
Yep,
Fair enough?
absolutely.
Yeah. And question number 5, how much is it going to cost? So then he starts talking about green premiums. Have you heard of green premiums before?
I've heard of them. I read when he first talked about them. I read his little Gates notes thing on it. Um, and then I read a little bit of criticisms about it just because it was a new concept at the time. And it's, at least from what he talks about, it's different than what most people would consider a cost on externalities. And so that's
Hmm.
why for him it has a different name because it serves a slightly different purpose. Well, I guess the same purpose, but in a slightly different format.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, sorry. You there?
Yes, I'm there. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I lost you for a sec because I was sharing it on Instagram. Doing the same thing. I really need to remember to do that like before we start talking instead of in the middle of it because then this happens. Sorry, but continue.
I think you did
Say
that
like the
last time
last.
too.
Yeah, I did. Say the last 5 words you had said.
Oh, what was the last 5 words that I said? The green premiums are basically. are looking to solve the same problem, or at least the same issue as the cost of externalities,
Yes.
just in a different
Yes.
format.
Yes. So I guess the part that I'm still kind of confused about having to do with green premiums is it implied that we would pay the difference to get people to use it even though it would cost more? Is that where the premium comes in?
So the premium, from at least what how he explains it, and this is why it's that different format is it takes basically whatever whoever's making the policy considers the base price for the green alternative, takes the
Mm-hmm.
price. I assume it would be the average or the base price, whatever they consider, for the fossil fuel, version, and then add the difference to the fossil fuel.
Mm-hmm. Right, right. Okay. So, and then he said that one thing that I thought was interesting that he specified was when he says, what are we willing to pay for? And then he's saying, well, what does we mean? And it's not just a matter of Americans and Europeans. Uh, it's not just the matter of what Americans and Europeans can afford, which I think is a very common argument for people who don't want to move on climate because they think that the rest of the world's not going to do it, is they assume that America will be forced to pay for everything, which is not, no. Um, um, and he said you can imagine green premiums high enough that the United States is willing and able to pay them, but India, China, Nigeria, and Mexico are not. So we need premiums that are so low that everyone would be willing to decarbonize, and that's a big challenge. Um, yeah, and he talked about the measurement system that shows the progress that green premiums are also kind of a measurement system that shows us the progress we're making towards stopping climate change, because if the premiums go, is it down? Yeah. If the premiums go down, then it means we're getting somewhere.
Yeah, which I think is one of the good aspects of what he deems green premiums is that it's a sliding measurement or sliding additional price. So the
Mm-hmm.
people who are
Mm-hmm.
paying for things, they can, I guess everybody's moving in one direction. It's great.
Right.
But
Exactly.
at the same time, I think in the couple paragraphs later, he acknowledges that green premiums for certain products are going to hurt low income families and and
Yeah.
societies, and that's where he's like, I'm not sure what to do there.
Exactly. Yeah. Like even though America in general has a better chance of being able to pay for uh green premium, the lower income people who already devote like 10% of their income to just energy and electricity, they could not handle having more to spend. So, or getting, sorry, that's no, having to spend more. There we go. That's the
Yes,
right term.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think at least for when he's talking about these premiums, I don't know. I assume he's going to talk more about it in the next couple chapters. But I
hmm
wonder, what would policymakers choose as the base um, cost for? I think for something I want to say simple as electricity, but it's never that simple. For electricity, what source would you use as your base payment, your base cost? And that would, I think, would be one of the big challenges is, how do
Yeah.
you set that up where it's like, what do you use? What are you taking an average? Are you taking the lowest? Who,
Right.
who we saying is who falls in what category? Is it federal? Is it state based? Is it, who are we just saying fossil fuels, or, are we doing each one, or are they particular on what premium is added? You know, so those are the things I would
hmm
like to see, and hopefully he explains a couple of them in the next couple chapters.
Yeah, I hope so too, because those are good questions. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then he did talk a little bit about direct air capture, um, which is
Mhm.
like a carbon capturing system. And I
Yeah.
appreciate that he kind of like poo-pooed it a little bit. Like he's still planning on like working on making it better, but he was like, this is an expensive and largely unproven technology. Because I feel like a lot of people really like to lean back on that idea that will just solve everything. Is just take CO2 out of the atmosphere. But it's like it's kind of still such a new process that we really shouldn't be relying on that being our saving grace.
Yeah, it's one of those tangents that people have thrown out there.
Mhm.
Ultimately, down the line, I'm sure it'll become a niche thing. There'll be a
Mhm.
handful of direct air capsule systems in place, but it won't be something, I don't know how quick they could deploy them. I don't know what the status of them even in terms of research and development is, you know. He mentions
Right.
it's
Yeah.
unproven, so I'm assuming there might be one or two pilot programs, and that's about it.
That's probably about right, honestly. He says using DAC approach to solve the climate change problem would cost at least $5.1 trillion per year, every year as long as we produce emissions. That's about 6% of the world's economy. But it's far cheaper than the cost of trying to reduce emissions by shutting down sectors of the economy.
I mean,
So,
yeah, that's one way to look at it because nobody wants anything to shut down. Um,
yeah,
for
yeah. So the final tip then is keep the green premium in mind and ask whether they're low enough for middle income countries to pay.
Yeah,
Fair enough.
and
Fair
I
enough.
guess that's the other question with the green premiums is if it's a nation thing, yeah, that affects prices for all incoming and exporting goods. And if you aren't trading with somebody like Europe, who I think now has, or at least is deliberating pretty heavy, some type of tax on products in and out, there might be a slight problem globally.
Hmm. Yeah, no, definitely. It's yeah, this is something that we're gonna have to like kind of tread lightly and figure out what works best for the most amount of people, and that's gonna be really hard. Yeah. Well, is there any other points you want to add for chapter 3, or should we move on to chapter 4?
Let's see. No, I think at least according to my notes, I covered everything that I wanted to take note of.
Cool. All right. Well, chapter 4 is called How We Plug In. 27% of 51 billion tons per year is electricity. So he's talking about electricity first because he has a love for electricity. So even though it's not the number one industry that is producing carbon, or yeah, it's his passion, and it's the second one. So he skipped the first one. He probably is going to go back to it on the next chapter. Um, I thought it was so nerdy how him and his son used to go and visit like power plants for funsies. It's
Have
so
you never?
cute. Like, of course, Bill Gates and his son would do that.
I mean, depending on the power plant, I think it'd be cool and to
Yeah,
see,
no, I think it would
especially
be really cool
if you
too.
get like a interesting like tour inside. That would be fun because I think people no, that's a world that a lot of people just never see. Even if you don't
Yeah,
understand anything about it, it's just fun to be like, wow, look at this.
yeah. No, that's definitely true. Honestly, I love the idea. I just, of course, Bill would be the one to think of that.
Yeah.
I just wouldn't
It's like,
even thought of,
this is
let's take my kid to a power plant.
instead of a camping trip, we're gonna go to a power plant. Um,
Yeah, exactly.
which is funny. But
Yeah.
yeah, this chapter, the first, I guess, handful of paragraphs before he dives into some of the other stuff is is really good. I mean, people we use electricity all the time, all day, every day, and it becomes something that people basically forget about. That it is there
Mm-hmm.
when you need it. That
Mm-hmm.
and it touches on how to move along to modernize. country needs reliable electricity. And there was recently, and I think it's still available, is for anybody
Mm-hmm.
who wants to better understand that, that electricity runs society in the modern world and developing countries, is to watch Juice. Oh, what is it called? Oh, how the world runs on electricity, and you can find it on Amazon or something. And it does a good
Interesting.
documentary to explain energy poverty and why we need electricity is the way. If you're gonna have a modern society, you need reliable electricity.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And he um talked about how the next places to really look at that are that don't have the luxury of constant electricity would be sub-Saharan Africa and India are like the
Yes.
top ones. Because they're still going to continue to have more people needing electricity, and currently
Hmm.
only less than half the population of sub-Saharan Africa has reliable electricity, and it just we as he said even further on is that China had the luxury of being able to grow with reliable electricity mostly from fossil fuels, and if the next coming developing countries want to grow right now, fossil fuels in the way that China did it is the economically best option. So how do we change that? um but maybe I'll get a little ahead of myself, but yeah, that
Yeah, no, that is one of the bigger things you see is, right now, India is really the place to watch for that,
yeah.
for making that transition work because they know it's
Hmm.
coming. Their people want it. They want reliable electricity.
Hmm.
And I don't know. There was another. There was a short article. I should have saved it, but
Hmm.
he's in a developing country, and they were just getting regular, reliable electricity, and a group came in and gave them some type of energy source, which was not as reliable as it should have been. And basically, the people, after about a couple of days, were just fed up with it. And they said, we want real electricity, meaning reliable, everyday electricity. And they went back to fossil fuels. I think they replugged back into the old coal plant or something that was, a couple miles down the street or whatever it was. And
Yeah.
that type of thing is like, well, that's something you really have to take in consideration when we talk about how you plug in developing countries.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, we just really need to find a way to do it well so that, yeah, it doesn't hurt the other countries and they're able to develop and not have to, suffer for this transition. Um, and that, uh, and that kind of goes into the next part of what he's talking about, which is, well, why is fossil fuel so cheap? Like, why is it so good? And some of the main parts that he mentions is, first of all, that it's widely available and it's become better and more efficient over time, which
Hmm.
arguably I would say some forms of renewable energy would have done the same thing if given the opportunity, but they weren't. Um, it's always easier to develop better technology when you are focusing on that industry. But also, they also have gotten a lot of government help to keep their prices low. For example, Congress enacted America's first protective tariff on imported coal in 1789, so it's basically the country as it is. And these tax expenditures represent, um, or the tax, yeah, the tax expenditures that the U.S. has given oil and gas producers has been about $42 billion from 1950 to 1978. So we've given them a lot of money to be cheap. So that's helped them.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we give a lot of subsidies to everybody. The fossil fuels have benefited for a long time with those subsidies, and policy-wise, it's going to be hard to get rid of. To do
Yeah.
that,
I think Biden
but
wants to get rid of them though.
yeah, it all depends on which ones he gets rid of.
Hmm.
I think some are more effective to get rid of, but others are, I think, entwined in other parts of law. So they might have to
Mm,
write up a whole nother set of stuff, and it might be easier just to increase cost on something rather than try to eliminate a subsidy. You know,
right.
but
Interesting.
you know,
Yeah.
all those
Yeah.
subsidies all the subsidies for all the energy sources all manipulate the actual price. So I mean, ideally, I'd like to see, everybody, at their true price, all externalities included, but I don't think we'll see that, and at least not in the next 10 years lifetime, at least.
Yeah, but we got to move somehow, right? So the question is, how
Yeah,
are we effectively moving towards zero? Because, I mean, it's that or climate disaster. So,
yeah, well,
love
it's
being
gonna
between a
be
rock and a hard place.
what people want to pay and what the costs are.
Yeah, true. The International Energy Agency estimates that government subsidies for the consumption of fossil fuels amount to $400 billion in 2018, and that's international.
Yeah.
And that the share of global power that comes from burning coal, which is roughly 40%, hasn't changed in 30 years. Natural gas hasn't really changed for 3 decades. And so they really did a very good job at keeping it incredibly stable.
Well, I
And
mean,
yeah,
ultimately, outside of emissions, they are pretty, stable energy sources.
mm-hmm,
Outside
mm-hmm,
of I guess at least here in the U.S., outside of the um, maybe the stability of generating power, coal at this point is pretty uneconomic. In other countries, they basically are burning the worst coal. So I think we're going to see this little share change quite quickly here in the next 5 years.
yeah, yeah. I mean, that's again, it's another thing though too, is that fossil fuels are a finite resource. You know, either we're going to get rid of them now and also reduce climate change, or we're going to get rid of them later when climate change already really, really sucks. So,
Yeah, I mean they are a finite resource. I guess how finite it is, I don't know. I don't have the what do you
I
want to
used
call
to have the numbers in
extractable?
front of me.
Yeah, the extractable resource availability. But I think we can almost guarantee that in the modern, I guess, in the most developed countries, coal will be going away quicker than anything.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, coal's really stagnated in the way of growth. I think it's actually starting to die in growth. So, hmm it which is good because it's really, really gross. Um, so they Bill Gates also mentions that in mid 2019, some 236 gigawatts worth of coal plants were being built around the world. So, that counteracted literally what I just said. Um,
Well, I mean, yeah, but what are you going to do at this point? Can't force them. The coal plant ultimately is a cheap, easy way to go if you're willing to pay for the coal.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. And that's basically the main way that China grew was via coal because the year 2000, 2018, they tripled their amount of coal production and boom, they got a lot of people out of poverty that way.
yeah, well, you got to use your natural resources to build up your country. And so, really, we're talking about how to plug in. I think that's the other thing. A lot of these countries are going to say, why don't we use our natural resources? They're there.
Hmm.
Let's use them. I think I saw,
Yeah.
last week we were talking about Nigeria and their natural resources under their ground. I think there was a recent article, and they just recently doubled down and they said, you know what? In the short term, we like the outlook for gas, coal, and oil. That's what we're going to continue to produce.
Great. Like I understand. It's just it goes again with the whole point of, yeah, all right, sure, use your natural resources for your country, but also there's kind of a blind eye to also all the negative effects that you're causing for your country, by doing things like burning coal and using fossil fuels, like especially in the immediate vicinity of those plants, and their harming of air and water quality. It's kind
Oh,
of, it's a give or take,
especially
but
the
it's
coal
so damn
plants. Yeah.
cheap. Exactly, but it's, and also, like miners' lungs and all that kind of stuff. Hey, we actually got a person. You want to hear what they said?
Yeah, let's play it before going on to anything else.
Have the alternatives to the fossil fuels, right? With batteries and such, and the mining process to get the lithium out of the ground is so harmful to the environment. It's like way worse and harmful environment to than fracking could ever be. But yet, everybody wants to go with electric cars when you just plug those up at the end of the night to get what recharged by fossil fuel.
Okay, okay, that's
I
some
mean,
fair points right
I
there.
mean, this ultimately his question goes back to one thing we just went over is, you know, what power, how much power are we using? What power are we using? Yeah, the mining is a whole nother discussion we can have because it does have a huge environmental impact, and we are going to continue to mine for natural resources. And I think we can really dive into that in that mineral resources discussion because the IEA just put out a new report on the use and impact of the minerals, the critical minerals that are going to be needed for the
Right.
whether it's for batteries or something. But he does make a fair point with outside of the lithium mining because it is when it is done, it is not done in any what we want to call ecologically safe manner. It is not like some of these other mining practices where they have gotten quite good at the environmental practices. Um,
Right. I will say
and
that,
so,
oh, at the most recent international conference, that actually was a topic that was brought up, and one of the goals um of at least like the Biden administration is to start talking about ways in which we can better our supply chain process for mining, and also through recycling of the products that we do take out of the ground, to hopefully decrease that impact a little bit. So I'm happy to hear that they actually seem to be taking that part of the problem seriously and beginning to have a real
yeah,
discussion about that, because yeah, mining is not going to go away. That's going to be an issue that will continue to be. I would be interested to look up and see what it does compared to fracking, because I don't know, I kind of feel like, maybe it's just because I feel like there's um minerals necessary for uh fossil fuel usage on top of fracking. And so I don't necessarily
with yeah,
agree that
without
it's
parameters set in
worse,
place,
but
without parameters put in place, it's and because there are two different methods, it is difficult to do a correct
uh,
comparison. Um,
exactly.
but
And also,
could you argue that like one mining pit versus one fracking site, which one's doing more environmental damage? Again, it comes down to what are your variables. In terms
right,
of
how
land
sustainably is
in
each
terms of like
process working?
land use, yeah, the mine is worse. In terms of contaminating things, the air pollution. It's like so you would really have to do a little bit of research, and I'm sure there are some research reports on it, and then compare the two. Um, but
Absolutely.
yeah, that is something they're going to have to tackle, and they're talking about it. You can see the reports that a lot of industry people are saying, "Hey, if you want to play this game, you're going to have to," as you said, set up a new supply chain, because
Hmm.
otherwise you're just shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is why it's important to look at all the different factors that are at play. Also, I would like to think that that when we plug in our electric vehicles, it won't be for too long that it will just give us fossil fuels. I think for one thing, because it just wouldn't look good if that was the case, hopefully renewable energy and nuclear will be a prioritization for what represents the electricity to come out of um, those like charging stations. But I'm not
Yeah,
sure because
I mean,
it's true,
that
but
I mean that goes into another discussion where it says, electricity, all it is electrons. It's electrons going through the transmission lines. You can't identify where that electron through the transmission line has come from once it goes through the transmission line. And so
right.
there is that discussion people are having on the electricity side of things and saying, how is there a way we could guarantee this is coming from this source? And currently, unless you have a direct line from your plant that's down the street, it's almost impossible to tell where your electricity is actually coming from, on the larger grid.
Okay, fair. So what I'm hearing is we just
I
need to
mean,
make the
and that's
energy
just one
grid
of
more
those things from
sustainable.
goes into the charging. The question, yeah, it mentioned the statement is, charging with fossil fuels. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, because you can't differentiate between electrons going through the transmission lines, yeah, you ultimately don't know currently. There's no good way to do it.
True, but that doesn't mean obviously that we shouldn't transition from fossil fuel burning cars to electric cars because by moving to electric cars, we at least have a little more of a say on what form of fuel is used. I mean, gas powered, therefore, that's the only option, right? But by having an electric vehicle, if the market changes, then at least that stays consistent.
Yeah. I'm not concerned so much about electric vehicles as I am the infrastructure around them, being in
Yeah.
place. There's a couple other new articles that came out that said basically, because of the purchasing of electric vehicles, or here and there, and it's not all over the place. Charging stations are basically building out, but they're not making money just yet. Not all of them. And
No.
so a lot of people are really kind of like, come on, guys, let's get this started, so we can put the infrastructure in place and make this, outside, something that's outside the cities. Uh,
Yeah. Demand and supply need to be growing at the same time. And right now it's kind of a wishy-washy situation. So hopefully when more of the environmental plans get implemented to encourage electric car adoption and spurring the growth of the charging stations, then we'll see that really take off more. We're on the precipice. It's close, but we're not quite there yet.
no, we aren't.
Yeah. Um, so in this chapter, he talks about premiums again. Um, he talks about how roughly 15%, or let's see, let me read the full sentence, Becky. Changing America's entire electricity system to zero carbon sources would require raising average retail prices by between 1.3 and 1.7 cents per kilowatt hour, roughly 15% more than what people are used to paying for. And that's where he talked about how $18 a month might be relatively affordable for the
Yeah.
average household in the US, but not necessarily for people of lower income. And we shouldn't make it an unjust process. So, yeah. And then he talks about how, on average, across all types of customers and states in the US, a kilowatt hour of electricity costs around 10 cents. And that price could go up to 20 cents if when we're moving because of that green premium. And Yeah, and then Africa and Asia are in the toughest positions because they want to follow in China's lead because it's still very economically um, realistic for them, but yet they're being told by everyone that that shouldn't be what they're doing. So it's kind of a weird dilemma. And the countries to watch are India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Pakistan, and nations throughout Africa. I'm kind of surprised that there aren't any South American countries mentioned. I don't know
Uh,
why.
I'm not sure either.
I mean, Mexico was mentioned before, but I don't think they really count as a. They're like one of the most developed countries in Central
let's
South
see. What
America. So
what what is? Let's see. Big investments. I mean, I don't know how large South America is going to grow. You know, and that might
yeah, I don't
be
either.
something. That may be the determining factor here, in
Yeah,
terms of
I just feel
growth
like South America
over
gets forgotten
time.
a lot. Yeah,
Yeah, it's your hopefully your peaceful neighbor, but then you get into the countries there and it's a big mess. Uh,
yep, yep,
so yeah, I think really yeah, he's just talking about the growth of those countries.
yeah,
They will
yeah.
be, you know, they will be the next I don't know powerhouses, but they'll be
The next
the
China.
second yeah, they'll be the second group that kind of binds together, kind of like the BRICS
Right.
currently.
Yeah, yeah, yep. And yeah, and he talks about how the natural gas plants have to keep buying fuel as long as they're running, and solar farms, wind, and dams get their fuel for free. So this is one of the puzzling pieces of renewable energy and why it's still more expensive. But then when you get into one, that fossil fuels are so cheap because they're just so widely available and so supported. But also that we really want actual like reliable energy, which can't always happen with the intermittency of wind and solar. Which is
Yeah.
why I still support offshore wind, and I feel like it doesn't get mentioned enough, but it's fine.
Well, we can touch on that in the next couple paragraphs here. But yeah, I mean, I think he lays out a pretty clear case, or he at least mentions the reality that, hey, look, this is the reality of solar and wind. As much as we like to use them, we have to understand, what their limitations are, and how they. Even though I think it's misleading to compare them to other power resources, you know, he does a good setup for that, leading into some of the other stuff he's going to talk about. But
Mm-hmm.
natural gas plants, they keep buying as long as they're running, and ultimately
Right.
that's why a lot of industry see them as continue to grow, because they are, e- I guess, they have the easy time of partnering with solar and wind plants on the same grid locations to match
Mm-hmm.
the usage.
Right. Right. Yeah, they can kind of just be like, yeah, you don't need to switch over to us. We can give you whatever you need.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
at the same time, buying fuel as you need it causes its own problems and its own unreliable issues. For
Yeah, that's
especially
where I think,
especially for extreme weather, both especially in the winter.
yeah,
So we saw in Texas,
yeah, yeah, definitely, definitely.
just
And he
just
also
more
talks about
problems we got to
the,
figure out.
yeah, as well as building new transmission lines, um, to make it so that wind and solar in areas that work for wind and solar, whenever they have surpluses of power, they can then give their power to places that don't have the ability to rely on wind and solar.
Yeah, that
So,
in terms of infrastructure, that's probably one of the biggest things holding back any of those projects for wind and solar is
mm-hmm,
the regulations for siting and permitting transmission lines to those new plant areas. There was a new article that came out that said basically, and I think they were talking to the Biden administration. They said basically, hey, we have at minimum 22 shovel-ready projects to go. We just need the siting and the permitting for all the transmission lines to go through, and then we can, be ready. But that
Right.
process takes that siting, that permitting for the transmission lines, connect to the plant, and whatever else is involved takes anywhere from 5 to 10 years sometimes. That's not very good for a quick transition, regardless of your
Right.
energy source. You know.
Well, so there needs to be a workaround. We need to treat this like getting the vaccine. It
Well,
needs to be whatever processes are needed kind of need to be expedited to some extent.
well, I mean, at that point, you can they should have done this a long time ago. Is just streamline all those
Uh-huh.
regulations and permitting. That doesn't
Uh-huh.
mean get rid of environmental protections. It just says,
No.
hey, let's get rid of some of the bureaucracy that's slowing this stuff down.
Exactly. Bureaucracy. Yeah. Yeah, that needs I think that's the thing. And honestly that I like that comparison between COVID and like renewable energy is that yeah, both cases they just kind of need to get through the long bureaucracy points to speed up the process for the sake of the emergency. We
Well,
found that is
yeah.
possible with the vaccine, so we can do it for other things too.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The government can put, what do they call it? They have a fancy name for it, but they basically do an exception for it for any of the regulations
Mm-hmm.
and let it streamline through.
Yeah.
It's like, well,
Yeah,
if there's an
exactly.
exception, you might as well leave that exception in. In many cases.
Yes. Yes. I agree. Let's see, what else did he say? He said, yeah, so he emphasized the fact that some areas just really aren't able to have like solar and wind. That's another
Yep.
thing us activists don't want to admit is
Oh
that
yeah, I hear it all the time.
some places, yeah, some places just won't be able to use solar and wind because they are in a cloudy and windy place.
Yeah,
Which is
I
hard to
always
believe over
refer.
here in California, but
Yeah, right. Whenever somebody brings that up, I always refer to a couple of NREL maps, the National Renewable Laboratory, and they have a great
mhm,
GIS map that show the best locations for your residential or for your larger scale wind and solar locations. It's like that's
mhm.
where people should be advocating for them. Otherwise,
Yeah.
you look silly, to say
Yeah,
the least.
every single place that says that would work for one of those things needs to get it immediately, and places that are unable to, okay, we need to figure that out. And
Yeah,
it's either through sharing some excess energy, which, as he also mentioned, doesn't really work when there's some countries that don't want to rely on other countries for the electricity supply. Um, so we need to then work around that. But yeah, that's honestly, I feel like he's building up to the part where then he could be like, this is where nuclear needs to go.
yeah, he covers a couple different sources, which is good. I applaud him for that, to do that. He does mention a couple other situations and locations around the world, in terms of
Mm-hmm.
what they've
Mm-hmm.
done, and he explains it pretty well. The Germany experiment, it hasn't worked out as
Mm-hmm.
nicely as they would have liked it to. You
Because of
know,
the
I,
surplus.
island countries, Japan can only effectively can only use a couple power sources to effectively power their country, and
Right.
you can't just drop in a battery or another type of source just because you like it better, or
Which he
it's
straight up
PRY
said
or
is,
PY, yeah, or PR wise it looks nice.
yeah, yeah. Which he straight up says, like, it's prohibitively expensive right now for battery storage. So that's
Yes.
depressing to hear, but I probably need to hear that.
Well, yes, batteries are yeah off on the
Yes.
horizon.
Yeah. But it's so limiting then. It's just like shit. We need
Yeah,
something.
well, on a slight different tangent, when you deal with batteries, then you have to deal with what's its capacity, what's its discharge rates, where is it going to be placed.
Right.
So there's some more technical stuff to deal with. If the especially if the battery is outside a residential size location or for a
Mm-hmm.
warehouse. At anything
Mm-hmm.
larger, it becomes very much. Is this more just a? Is it just offsetting things, or is it transitioning cost? And there are other people who can talk about that because it gets
Yeah.
complicated. It sounds like.
People that are smarter than us
Yeah.
can talk about that. Yeah. I love saying that because it gets me off the hook. Um, so yeah, so he talks about batteries and he talks about how there's also a difficulty with variation. So there's variation day to day when it comes to like solar and wind availability, and then on top of that,
Yep.
there's also variation season by season. Um, and so that's a really big hurdle too, because then you get over generation in the summertime and you get under generation in the wintertime. And it can be really hard and expensive to keep energy for that long. Um, like that was collected during the summer to then be used during the winter time. That's a big ask.
Yeah.
So,
Well, yeah. Yeah. That becomes seasonal storage, and that's
yeah.
not something you really see currently. And that
No.
you talk about having power here and power there because of the weather, the seasons, whatever else interferes. And that comes
Mhm.
back to another thing that I think is important to, and he mentions it a little bit with the power, the power peak is what it's called installed capacity versus generating capacity. So you can have
Mm.
your energy source installed at 100 megawatts. I'm just going to use 100 megawatts because it's an easy round number. But your generated capacity is the percentage that it produces at that point in an ideal situation. And so solar
Right.
has, at best, a 30% generating capacity. And so at any
Mhm.
given, at an ideal situation, it's only generating 30% of that 100 megawatts. That's
Mhm.
not the best for some locations. And this is global installed generating capacity in average. And there are maps for the US. And then, wind is 45% at generating capacity at best. And then you have things like, fossil fuels are anywhere from 60 to 80, where they're always running every day at that
Right.
megawattage. And then, nuclear is at the highest at anywhere from 90 to 95. And so that is also something people really need to take in account when they start, what do we want here? How are we replacing this? Because if you take out a coal plant that's running at 1,000 megawatts at, say, 70% uh, generating capacity, and then you plug in a solar plant taking up a lot more space, but only, giving you a third you know, of the electricity produced, you've got to put something else there. Whether it so happens to be a gas plant, or say we're in the future, it's a large battery. Those are
Yeah.
things that you have to take into account. Otherwise, your grid is going to be much more unreliable than you ever thought it could be.
Right. Right.
But
Well, see, and then
in the
that's
newspapers, you always have whenever you read articles, the number that you see for megawatts is always the installed capacity. And I think people need to understand that when they start touting things like that's great, but you have to understand this is how it's actually working for you in the real world.
right. Yeah, well, see, that's another thing though too, is another reason why like solar power in particular does have some benefits to it is that it doesn't necessarily have to be um, on its own land. You know, that's why we have rooftop
Yeah,
solar and all that kind of stuff. Like there's other methods to compound on top of
yeah.
renewable energy or have renewable energy on top of something else that makes the whole
Mm,
space per kilowatt hour not
yeah.
as problematic as it
Well,
initially sounds.
eh, I think it's an issue when it comes to
It's still
large
an issue.
scale electricity generation. But I agree
Yeah,
that if you put solar on rooftops, carports, whatever, brownfields, remediation locations, great. I guess you have net metering to deal with depending on the city and the state you're in, but that makes more sense to me than saying let's take up all this space. I think it was actually California, uh, and they did it on public
probably.
lands. Yes,
Probably.
because that's where they can get away with it.
One of the
But they put
largest
out
solar
two
farms
thousand
in,
acres for a measly 350 megawatts.
I'm pretty sure
To
that's
me,
the farm that I live right next to.
that's a poor use of solar panels
Yeah,
and versus protecting the environment. I'd much rather
yeah,
see every household get benefits for putting solar on their rooftops or however that's going to work for them. Um,
right.
but they got the permit for it, and we'll see what happens.
True, true.
So, but he does touch on that type of situation. I think we're going to see a little more of that, especially if they run out of public land to put some of this stuff on.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
You
Okay, we
know.
need to speed up this because we're not going to get through this chapter at this rate.
Oh
Like
yeah, we.
ever, we're already over an hour.
Oh, and we aren't
So,
even. Yeah, okay, well, we can get through this pretty quickly.
yeah, okay. So let's kind of do a little more of a lightning round, I guess. So, basically we're going to kind of just talk about some of the parts that we highlighted in particular. So one part that I highlighted was on page 79, and it says most experts agree that as we electrify other carbon-intensive processes like making steel and running cars, the world's electricity supply will need to double or even triple by 2050. So it further talks about how we need to prepare for the fact that the demand is just going to grow, which again, that's where I argue that that's where like increasing efficiency helps, um, for like buildings and that kind of thing, which I think he gets further into in a bit. Um, yeah. So is there anything on page 79 to 80 that you highlighted that you want to share?
Nope, I think we've covered that pretty well.
Okay. Page 81, I liked the part where he said variable energy sources like solar and wind can play a substantial role in getting us net zero. In fact, we need them to. We should be deploying renewables quickly wherever it's economical to do so, which was kind of a bit of a juxtaposition sounding to what he was saying before, which was all the cons of renewable or solar and wind. So I liked that he then, you know, brought it back and was like, hey, but we still need it. I'm not saying we don't. I'm just saying it's not as great as some of the activists say it is.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
in 81 basically, yeah, he kind of just sets down reality 81 to 83, you know,
Mm-hmm.
on the things we basically covered some of this on our tangent conversation just a few minutes earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, exactly. So we've already covered that. He says that we can solve the problem by crisscrossing the country with thousands of miles of special long distance power lines carrying what's called high voltage current. And he said that he, in particular, has been working on that project a little bit through creating a code that can kind of help power the whole system. Because why not? Honestly, we're already so techy and stuff. Why not just act like the power grid is like a computer web, you know?
Mm, I don't know. I like the manual grid a little bit, but I don't know enough about it to see what, the
Why,
advancements are going to be.
what do you like about the manual electric grid
I mean, I just
that
don't
you,
think our grid needs to be fully, I guess it needs to be automated a little bit and modernized, but not to the point that it's connected to, something like the internet.
that does sound like a national security issue.
Yes, very much so. I think it should be disconnected from any. It could be an intranet um, um, setup. I think I'd be
Yeah.
okay with that.
Well, I think that's why I also like the idea of smaller community grids, like microgrids. I like that
Mm,
idea more because I think it provides more opportunity to prevent bad things from happening in a large space of time, like larger power outages and stuff. But at the same time, then when it comes to things like what Texas experienced and they're not able to connect to other grids for help, that can be an issue. So it kind of has to go both
yes.
ways.
Yeah, and there are different types of microgrids too. I think we had mentioned this just briefly, but there are microgrids that are connected to the larger grid. They're, within the grid itself. They're separated. Um, that's something else we can talk about because they do each have their advantages and disadvantages depending on your setup.
Right, right. Yeah. Yeah, my idea, by the way, for the channel is I want to cover hydrogen, because I think that's the main form of energy generation that I haven't touched on yet in on my channel. But then I also then want to go to things such as energy storage, energy efficiency, and that's where like the minerals come in
Yes.
that
Yeah.
conversation. So kind of moving from the actual energy sources to the other aspects of the topic, which is kind of like what he's doing. So yeah. um, and he does talk about some construction pieces that are coming along, like some experimental construction that's happening to improve our transmission of energy, such as the Transwest Express, which is supposed to um, create move wind generated power from Wyoming to California and the Southwest, which would begin in 2021 and be operational by 2024. Which, and then he mentions it's 17 years after the planning date. I kind of hope that because it's such a new idea, of course, it's going to take longer for the whole planning thing to be figured out. But once someone breaks through into the actual like production of the industry, then at least there'll be a blueprint for others to follow.
Yeah. Well, and that 17 years goes back to what we were talking about before. The heavy siting and permitting regulations and the bureaucracy basically caused that time lag. And if
Yeah,
that project, which started back then, took 17 years, it better be a lot quicker for our new projects. Anything that starts, right now.
yeah, exactly. So it needs to be a combination of cutting the bureaucratic tape and also streamlining the process so that it's not as much of a mental strain for people to figure out. Yeah, and yeah, so he talks about the computer model to work on the power grid, which I just think is really interesting, also from the perspective of a software engineer, like not me, Gates. Excuse me.
Man, yeah.
Bless me. It's getting passionate. But I think it's an interesting idea, and if anyone could figure it out and do it like in an ethical way, it's Gates. So I would be interested to see what he comes up with. And then he also talks about we'll save money by building renewables in the best locations, building unified national grid, and shipping zero emissions electrons wherever they're needed. So that kind of left me with a bit of a cool image, at least for what is possible, for what we can do having to do with renewable energy. Um, yeah, and he also talks about specifically electrical service towards each household, and as we electrify this whole thing, we're going to need to further encourage the electrification of our households, and to remove the eyesore of power lines. There's an option of burying them underground, but right now it's expensive, so people need to work on that. um, So that's an area of research.
Oh yeah, well, power line siting for transmission lines becomes both an eyesore in many places, and it becomes an issue of eminent domain by, governments and state governments taking over land of people and landowners. And
Right.
that'll be a contention in some places, but because it's a real concern. You know, if you're gonna tell me, I'm gonna have a transmission line here, but you can't do anything about it because I'm using eminent domain, a lot of people are gonna fight against it, even if it is, fine and dandy that we have carbon-free electricity coming through those transmission
Right.
lines.
Yeah, no, that's true. Needs to be cost effective, needs to be optimized, needs to be not intrusive. Yeah. Sounds like
Other
it needs
people
to
have a
be
lot of
too.
things to worry about.
Yeah, no kidding. Seriously. Yeah. So then he talks about yeah, building renewables and that there's research going on, and then he goes more specifically into the different carbon-free electricity options. So,
Yep.
Mickey, number one, nuclear fusion. Go.
All day, yeah. All day, every day for nuclear power. Um, he covers the issue in a very general manner, which is great. But I like that he does mention, the materials used is on the low end of the scale. It's not dangerous, blah blah blah. The only thing I disagree with him on nuclear is his statement that the waste is hard to store. It's not a science or an engineering problem. We have that covered. It's a political issue. So otherwise, I think I agree with him, on everything he says for the most part.
Interesting. Yeah, yeah, what he says for the most part for me is not too surprising. Just from after doing the video on nuclear and stuff, I've definitely become more pro nuclear. I'm still hesitant on new nuclear production though. I don't know, but also his further
I'll just
explanation
send
of
you some
the
resources.
pitfallings. Ha. The the further explanation of the pitfalls of renewable energy sources makes nuclear energy seem more appealing and those problems seem not quite as bad. So,
Mhm.
yeah. Well, is there anything else you want to say about that section of nuclear fission? I mean,
No, nuclear. No, I mean nothing. Yeah, besides the
okay.
waste statement. That's all. Yeah,
Yeah. Now compare it to nuclear fusion.
it's a great idea, but it's still in research development phase.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the gist, honestly.
Yeah, I mean that's the end of that one. I think there's two facilities that are doing research, but they're nowhere close to having a running facility of fusion.
Yeah. I like how he mentions fusion is 40 years away and it always will be, and that's a joke amongst
Yeah.
nuclear scientists. And he
Yep.
says, admittedly, I'm using the term joke loosely.
Oh yeah, yeah, it
Yeah.
absolutely is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or here's
Um,
your friend, offshore wind.
yes, offshore wind. Yeah, it only represents a tiny part of the current energy generation. I think the US has like I think 5 offshore wind turbines on their whole goddamn coast. And
They're
it's in Rhode
they're on the
Island.
East Coast, aren't they?
Yeah, they're in Rhode Island.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's what it is.
Um, so as he says, the offshore wind industry, there's nowhere to go but up. And wind turbines, yeah, they can get bigger, and so the bigger they are, the less turbine is, the less number is required to generate the same amount of power. I mean, these things are huge.
Oh,
Um,
I've seen the diagrams for them. Yeah,
yeah, yeah. So he seems very stoked about it, and I'm really happy that he did cover it, because it's I think it's one of the most underappreciated forms of energy generation. There, of course, is going to be environmental impacts to think about and that kind of thing, but I think
absolutely.
offshore wind got a lot of its technological inspiration from offshore drilling. So the topic of pros and cons and environmental impact is not a new topic when it comes to
No.
building off site, you know. So I think that also is something to consider. And for those who are like, no, it's going to be a lot of noise pollution and it's going to be a huge environmental disruption, what would you call offshore drilling then? I would like
I
offshore
mean,
drilling to be replaced by offshore wind. I mean, they're definitely going to be quieter, they're going to be less harmful to the environment, and there's also going to be less, if very little product problems such as oil spills that you have with offshore wind. So,
I think the biggest thing for offshore wind is really going to be the cost of those transmission lines.
yes, yes,
You know,
that
and
is the
that's going to
biggest
be
issue.
that'll be the determining factor if offshore wind ever gets off the ground. At a at a regular pace is, can we make the transmission cheap as possible? Because if you can do that, I mean, put
You're
them on
golden.
your land shelf. Go to it. Don't disrupt shipping lanes and all the other fun stuff. But if you get the siting permit for it, I guess
Go
you're
forth.
okay.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, yeah, it's Bay for a reason. Okay, next one is geothermal. So, that one is kind of a shorter section for a reason, and it's also interesting that those are the only sections that he covers. He doesn't cover any more having to do with just plain old wind and energy and hydropower and biomass. So it's interesting that those are the main ones that he chose.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think he's just picking up the primary ones that could be expanded a bit more. We're not going to expand hydropower anymore. There's very few, if not any more sites that we can really effectively put hydropower. So I think that's why it's kind of not in this section.
But what about onshore wind and solar?
Well, they can be expanded into other locations. Hydro can't.
No, I know, but
Well,
they weren't really brought up in
no, but
this.
what I'm talking about is they have potential to be expanded. We're not going to build
Yeah.
a new dam for hydropower. That's why it's not in this section.
Oh, I see. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
But okay, yeah. So what he says about geothermal is that, well, first of all, for those that don't know, geothermal is where we pump water at high pressure under the rocks and it absorbs heat and it comes out through another hole to turn a turbine or generate electricity in some other way. So that's what geothermal is. And he recommends this 2009 book about it. And yeah, it's because geothermal is really, it's available only in very specific locations.
Yeah.
It's only really useful for certain groups. But this to me is an example of where it really is important to focus regionally when it comes to deciding power generation because it's very much not a one size fits all.
No, that's absolutely true. Going back to
Yeah.
those NREL maps that I mentioned for wind and solar, they also have one for
Mhm.
geothermal. And basically,
Mhm.
basically geothermal, if it's ever going to be used again commercially, here in the U.S. I think there's one or a couple spots, but at a much larger scale, it'll be out west.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
because that's just where it would just be best to do so. It's like great if a company wants to move in and use the process to do so. More power to
Literally.
them.
And now we go on to storing electricity. So batteries. Um, I love how he starts by saying, "I spend way more time learning about batteries than I ever would have imagined."
Mm,
Me too, Bill. Me too. Um, so yeah, so he talks about the limitations of lithium ion batteries, um, and that they're kind of hard to improve. So they're kind of hard to get rid of those limitations. Um, and and so that's it's kind of limiting. That's unfortunately not really an area that we can continue to move towards for much longer, but there are other options out there. that he brings up. But yeah, so that's others are working on things like flow batteries, which involves storing liquids in separate tanks and then generating electricity by pumping the fluids together. So I kind of, to be honest, that's one that I like. I think that it's cool because it's scalable. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and I just recently kind of dived into batteries and storage just to see, technology-wise, because there are always people who are touting them and such, but we haven't seen, you know, them selling like hotcakes or being, uh, in factory settings, being just pushed out. So I think it's something to watch. And if somebody can make a breakthrough in terms of capacity, use and discharge rates, then they might be able,
Mm-hmm.
they might be able to put them in niche locations.
Right. Yeah, I'd like to think that we're close to having some sort of battery sort of revolution. I really hope we are, but it's hard to rely on something that's just really up in the air.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
again, it's one of those things where people always like to look at it, but have, 3/4 of the reality is that it's in research and development still. Even with
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
the supposed deployment of some of the batteries.
Right. Yeah. Well, so then the next one is pumped hydro. Do you want to explain a little bit about that one?
I mean, basically, pumped hydro is, very simply, it's from the dam or the reservoir. It's pumped up the hill, and then you just let it go when it's needed. Uh, you know,
Mm-hmm.
moving the turbine. Very simple, but it only works in places where you have a dam. So it's very
Damn.
limited.
I made a damn joke. Sorry.
Yeah, I noticed. But the statement, right here,
Moment of
it basically
silence for the
says,
damn joke.
the statement is the 10 largest facilities in the United States can store less than an hour's worth of the country's electricity consumption. That that right there tells you about the scale of pumped hydro. Less than an hour's worth. When you
Yeah,
talk about
that's
those types of numbers, it's like, well,
well,
better not rely on it.
next. Yep. Next. So next one is thermo storage. Thermal storage, which basically is when electricity is cheap, you use it to heat some material up, and then when you need more electricity, you use the heat to generate power via a heat engine. And this can work at 50 or 60% efficiency, which ain't bad. So at TerraPower, which is one of the locations that, or one of the energy storage companies that Bill started.
It's his nuclear company.
Yeah, yeah, right. Um, at TerraPower, they're trying to figure out how to use like molten salt for that. And it's an idea that's promising, but definitely still in process.
Yeah, I'd rather see. I don't know. I don't know enough about the technical stuff, but I'd almost rather see thermal storage over battery storage. Um, but
Mm-hmm.
you know, just
I
because it,
think
it
Bill would
seems like
too.
it may work better in terms of
Yeah,
just long term, use.
yeah, yeah. I think Bill would agree with you. Otherwise, he wouldn't put money into it.
Yeah, that's true, right?
Yeah. So good job. You're thinking like Bill.
Now I just got to make
um.
money.
Yeah. Yeah. Casual. Go work for Bill.
If only.
If only. So the next one is cheap hydrogen. And that one's also really a promising idea because hydrogen can then kind of sorry, my brain died in the middle of forming that sentence. Okay. Um, hydrogen is used for fuel cell batteries, right? So then the fuel cells get their energy from a chemical reaction between two gases, and the byproduct is water. So they could use electricity um, to create hydrogen and then store hydrogen as compressed gas and then put it through a fuel cell when they need to generate it on demand. So it's almost kind of like hydro, but it's like hydrogen version,
Yeah.
which is a little
Well,
confusing because hydros also sounds like a nickname for hydrogen, but
well, they both are made of hydrogen atoms. That's why that's there.
thank you. Thank you, Captain Obvious.
Well, I don't. For hydro, I think it's just water, but simply,
Yeah. Yes.
they both have oxygen and hydrogen atoms. But yeah, I mean, hydrogen, you see a lot of investment, especially in Europe, for
Mm-hmm.
hydrogen facilities, hydrogen pilot town. There were a couple of them. And yeah, I think it's just a matter of if they can get it to work, because, he mentions that storage is a huge problem. Um, and it
Mm-hmm.
does eat away at regular piping, especially the piping that you usually use for natural gas.
Right.
And if you, I mean, and basically creating it with an electrolyzer, the cheapest way to do that is just to attach it to a nuclear power plant. Then you have all the cheap hydrogen that you need.
Mm-hmm. No, it's true because yeah, hydrogen's a byproduct, right?
No, it's not a byproduct. The
Oh.
nuclear power plants can produce excess heat and electricity depending on how they're hooked up. And so if you attach an electrolyzer there, well, there's no it can just produce the hydrogen, as needed.
Mm.
It just goes. So you could have it attached to, like, you could set up the infrastructure, pump it into whatever you need, or you could have somebody siphon it off and put in the storage tanks if they ever figure out that deal. But it is
Right.
cheaper when you can run it when you can produce hydrogen all the time, very often, and nuclear allows you to do that
Mm-hmm.
without
Mm-hmm.
diverting the excess heat to anything else, or
Mm-hmm.
the excess
Right.
electricity if it's depending on how the grid's working.
Right. Right. No, that's very true. Fair enough. So, if you had to choose between any of the forms of battery storage that was just mentioned, what would you go with?
Oh, out of the four for storing electricity, I'm just gonna go thermal, just because I think it's the most interesting out of the four.
Yeah, I think I would go to with hydrogen because it does stuff like pair well with nuclear.
Oh, it absolutely does. But they're all, I mean, except for the pumped hydro and maybe the newer batteries, they're both just kind of sitting there waiting for their tipping point.
Yeah, they're waiting for their time to shine. Just give them a chance, guys. Yeah. Okay, so then he goes into other categories. So other innovations, and the first one is carbon capturing, which, as he mentioned earlier, is a technology that really isn't really fully developed enough to be all that notable.
No.
But there's some interesting research going on.
Yeah. I think we may see more carbon capture just because natural gas plants are sticking around. And because of that, and then, in some countries or in other places here in the US, maybe, is the inevitable, greenhouse gas clampdown. And if that happens, there'll be more incentive to, put up one of the carbon capture systems on the natural gas plants.
Well, I feel like as we're seeing in the consumer world, people are much more willing to just pay for an extra offset instead of actually changing their lifestyle. So it would be
Yeah,
a nice
it's
thing
easier.
that people would be able to do. Yeah, it's easier. Doesn't mean we shouldn't change our lifestyle because we shouldn't rely on that. But it would be also nice to have, and we kind of need it because we need to be taking carbon out of the atmosphere while doing all the other things to reduce our output. So, because we're that far along in the problem. Yeah. And then he does talk about energy efficiency. And and he said he used to scoff at it. Okay, Bill. Um,
So we're scoffing at it. How dare you?
yeah. How dare you? But yeah, he talks about how much space, he reminds us how much space every piece of energy generation requires, besides like
Yep.
fossil fuels and stuff. And so it does make sense to shift the demand or the load um, of what is required to be able to better use our energy. And part of that is making systems more efficient by possibly utilizing them in the middle of the day where energy uh, isn't as isn't as demanded upon as in the evening. Like maybe your, I don't know, your washer and dryer automatically would start running more in the middle of the day rather than the evening. I don't know. I'm trying to think of an example here of where that would apply. Oh, the water heater. There we go.
Mm.
Uh, we'll be able to switch on at 4 p.m. when the power is less in demand instead of 7 p.m. Or you could plug in your electric vehicle when you get home for the day and it would automatically wait to charge itself until 4 a.m. when the electricity is the cheapest. Um, so I guess if all electric cars did that, then that would make it more expensive. But like
Yeah.
evening out the power demand in general in different ways. And energy utility companies are already trying to encourage people to do that by making it cheaper, um, by use energy in the slower parts of the day. So they are trying to do that, but I think that it would be helpful if the consumer didn't even have to think about it and that was like an automatic setting on some appliances.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, we either have to be on the appliance or your system of your house would have to be tapped into the utility system where it would, notify it or whatever and say, yes, let's run this. We can run this or, don't run this. You would have to
Yeah.
basically I guess what's the word? Basically reset the house for, smart use again.
Right.
Outside of, that's what it would take when you build a new building or apartment set or whatever.
Yeah.
Um,
So I found it interesting that he really didn't talk all that much about prior by making energy usage more efficient through infrastructure purposes. And I hope that he covers that more in a later piece because I think of that as the main way of increasing efficiency in our energy use is just by making industries and households and development projects more um, energy efficient, you know? So that's where I feel like it would be the most impactful rather than only focusing on when the energy use is at its peak versus not. I think that's also important, but um, I don't think that that's the only version of energy efficiency that should be thought of. So I hope he goes into other ones more and like infrastructure and that kind of thing. So
yeah, I haven't
that
read
being
it far.
said,
I haven't read enough far ahead enough,
me
or
neither.
even just yet to comment if he's going to talk about it or not. But we'll see.
Yeah, yeah, no, me neither. I hope so. I mean, because he's talking about cement production and that kind of thing, like maybe that'll come up because of that too. But I feel like if he doesn't bring it up, it's a missed opportunity because I think that that is a really important aspect to look at when we're talking about energy efficiency.
Mm,
Are you
yeah, we'll
looking?
see. I'm looking in the index to see if it's brought up in more than one place, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Energy. Yeah, let's see. I don't see anything. Emission. I don't see anything on efficiency specifically,
Damn, Bill.
though I think he probably will touch on it some more, maybe.
Yeah, I hope so, because I feel like that's kind of a no-brainer way, like aspect of energy efficiency, but I don't
He
know.
might talk. Yeah, he might talk about it in Probably in the next couple chapters, because he has the electrification, heating, cooling for manufacturing, transportation, home heating,
Okay, yeah.
energy
So
energy
that's
efficiency.
the
There
area.
it is.
Yeah,
Energy
okay, so it is
efficiency.
there.
So in the next two
Yay.
chapters, or maybe three, whatever it is. So we are going to talk about it. Looks like.
Good, Bill. Okay, good. All right. Well, with that being said, I'm going to read just the last little bit of this chapter because I don't know, I like to end it with the author's voice. Um, so he says, keep in mind that although we need to pursue all these ideas, we probably don't need all of them to pan out in order to decarbonize our power grid. Some of the ideas overlap each other. If we get a breakthrough in cheap hydrogen, for example, we might not need to worry as much about getting a magic battery. What I can say for certain is that we need a concrete plan to develop new power grids that provide affordable zero energy electricity reliability whenever we need it. If a genie offered me one wish, a single breakthrough in just one activity that drives climate change, I'd pick making electricity. It's going to play a big role in decarbonizing other parts of the physical economy. I'll turn to the first of these, how we make things like steel and cement, in the next chapter. Me too, Bill. I would also have the genie pick that one. I agree.
Yep, I agree
Okay.
too.
And with that being said, that is chapter 3 and 4 of Bill Gates' How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. And we're going to read chapters 5 and 6 for the next book club next week. So, yay! All right. Yeah,
Sounds like a
we'll
plan.
see you next Wednesday on Stereo and next Thursday on the Beckosphere Climate Change channel. Yeah. Okay. Bye, Mickey.
See ya.